I'll just try and get this shared, sorry. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. So yeah, it's bringing together some of a couple of areas of interest. So as I said, my background is doing kind of buildings archaeology, particularly prisons, which I worked on in Northern Ireland, but I've also worked in the Republic of Ireland in similar things. And there's a similar but different things going on in the different parts of Ireland. So this paper is going to be talking about contemporary archaeology and its potential role within development archaeology. I was asked to be involved in a consultation about what to do with historic buildings, which were considered particularly sensitive and political. And these were Magdalene laundries, which I'll describe what they are a little bit later. And I was brought in to do consulting around a planning process where one of the buildings was going to be converted into housing, which still actually hasn't happened yet. But these are really contested sites, and they're contested for a number of reasons, but primarily because of long histories of institutional abuse, which continued up until the late 1990s. So there's still a large number of people who were victims and survivors of these institutions. And they've went through different types of judicial reviews, which have often really focused on archives as being the main way to access, what happened in these sites. And so my focus has been on how we can try to work within the development context in archaeology to better understand these sites, but in ways that bring together text and people as well as objects. And so I want to talk a little bit about Donnybrook in particular, which is the Magdalene Laundry I was asked to consult with. And I've also done some work at two of the other ones, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So to give a very brief overview, I'm going to give a brief background of what Magdalene laundries are. Some people know them because there was a number of films made about them, and also because of the judicial reviews done about them, but they're slightly more complex than often they are presented. And so I'll talk a little bit about those histories. And then the issues of sources. So I'm always really interested in how we do archaeology, particularly contemporary archaeology, and particularly in terms of issues which are political, relating to conflict or other associated issues in Ireland. And particularly the over-reliance on archives as our main ways to access the recent past. I'd be particularly interested in advocating for material culture to be another way in, but also combining that with oral histories, particularly when we're working with recent past where there are people alive who were associated with the things that we're studying. I'll talk a little bit about the role of development in contemporary archaeology and the study of recent past in Ireland. And then I'll mainly talk about Donnybrook, which is the Magdalene Laundry in South Dublin, which I studied, with some references to a different type of Magdalene Laundry, which still survives in another part of inner city Dublin called Sean McDermott Street. And then just a few little conclusions. It's kind of text heavy at the start, just while I give some of the background, and then it'll get more kind of image related. So it'll be a little more interesting as things go on, I promise. So Magdalene laundries, to give you a very brief background, were carceral institutions which held girls and women who were assigned to them through a variety of routes. The women and girls were set to work in these industrial laundries, and what they did was wash, iron, and repair laundry, and also make lace and other little domestic things like that from people on the outside who were either in industrial and domestic settings. And I'll show a little bit about that from the contents of the laundries later on. There's a kind of assumption that these are Catholic institutions and that they're associated with Ireland, but they're not uniquely Irish, nor are they uniquely Catholic, but they had a heightened role in the newly independent Catholic Ireland, which broke from Britain in 1921-22. So we're talking about the 26 counties, though interestingly, religious institutions on the island of Ireland continued to be all Ireland entities after partition. So I think that's something that we've really missed, is actually talking about what's happened in the north and the similar institutions, which there were 10 in the Republic of Ireland. There were 4 in Northern Ireland, 3 Catholic and 1 Protestant, and there were Protestant ones in the Republic as well. In the contrast to the 19th century forms, they were harsh carceral institutions where often socioeconomically marginalized and vulnerable girls and women were held for extended periods. Primarily, these were girls and women who came from working class backgrounds and often from broken families or from families where there was evidence of abuse. But there's also quite a substantial number of middle class girls and women, and particularly those who were considered to be, transgressing outside of traditional female roles. It's often associated with pregnancy, but actually 80% of the girls and women held at Magdalene Laundries were not pregnant, or were not pregnant outside marriage anyway. But there was often kind of heightened fears in Catholic Ireland about women and women's sexuality and this desire to control them. So the Magdalenes, as they were called, were processed and treated like prisoners. They were given new names, they were given uniforms, often given severe haircuts, and that was a form of punishment also, was to cut the hair right back. And they had very tightly controlled schedules, which were mainly focused on working. Most were there without sentence or having committed any crime, but they weren't often given any end date. So some people stayed there for short amounts of time, months, maybe small number of years. Some people there for decades, and it's not always clear why or how that happened. There were some women who were sentenced by courts for minor offences, but they were often sent by social services, families and/or local priests, and often without any endpoint. The girls and women who escaped or tried to escape were often located by police and returned. And so part of what the reckoning has been with this recent past is that the state was actively complicit in the mass incarceration, forced retention and exploitation of these girls and women. We don't know the exact figures because the record keeping not only hasn't been very good, but also hasn't been very openly accessible. There were two significant reports conducted by the state, which were both quite partial for different reasons. One was called the McAtackney report, which was about the state involvement in the running of Magdalene Laundries, and they made that very specifically about state involvement, so they cut out lots of other things they could have looked at. And they estimated at least 10,000 girls and women were held from the formation of the state in 1921-22 until the last one closed in 1996. The Northern Ireland Magdalene Laundry and Mother and Baby Home report, which came out in 2021, estimated nearly 3,000, but we don't really know because the records are not brilliant. Only 3 of the Magdalene Laundries, 3 which are in the Republic of Ireland, still survive in any sense of completeness, 2 in Dublin and 1 in Cork, and I'll show you some pictures of those later. To give you some sense of the geography of these, it's interesting when often this is talked about. The partition of the island is very prominent. Until really I started doing work on this, nobody talked about the Magdalene Laundries in the north. But as you can see, what's interesting about them is, apart from 2 being in Belfast, which was the capital of the north, one is in Newry, which is just on the border, and the other is in Derry, which is on the other border. So essentially they worked on a cross-border basis. So they held women and children and trafficked them back and forth between those institutions. And we actually know that some of the institutions in the far south had close connections with institutions in the north. So some of them down near Waterford, one of them in particular, New Ross, had connections with Newry, and they would send women back and forth because a lot of what they wanted to do was break the women's social connections with the area they came from. So they would often be sent to places that they did not come from. So that is something that's really not been looked at. And it's very difficult to do this work in the north because we can't really access a lot of those sites. The one in Newry was bulldozed in the last couple of years, and one of the ones in Belfast is still in operation, and we can't really access the site. I've got access to the convent, but I didn't get access to the laundries. So in terms of issues of sources, we have quite a few sources, and they're quite long and quite detailed. The religious orders archives have been the main source of information for what the operations of these institutions and how they've been used. As I said, there've been a number of reports. There's McAtackney, and his report in 2013 was the first major one, and that came off the back of reports into abuse in children's homes, which the Ryan report came out a number of years before that. So we've had this kind of sequence in the 1990s of reports around institutional abuse. And this is important because Ireland was the most institutionalized country in the world in the 1950s and 60s. Like, a part of the way that the church and state interacted was to institutionalize people into lots of different types of institutions, and they tended to survive a lot longer in Ireland than they did elsewhere. So there's a lot of people alive who were in them who can testify to what happened in them. And the Mother and Baby Homes report came out in 2021. It was supposed to do a better job than the McAtackney report. McAtackney mainly focused on archives and had a small section on oral histories, which was still quietly controlled and quite sympathetic to the nuns. The Mother and Baby Home Report was supposed to be set up with a whole oral archive attached to it, but it was incredibly badly done and has been very controversial because of that. And indeed, the Northern Ireland report, which was a Mother and Baby and Magdalene Laundry report, which was done over a much smaller period of time and, was done by 2 academics, actually was much more thorough and better. But they still didn't really engage with oral histories as a primary way of accessing the site. And they've had a very strong focus on these kind of legalistic routes to understanding the past, and also not believing women and girls who were held in those institutions and not looking at the material sites to see what they can tell us. There have been a number of activist academic oral archives created, and the most famous one, this is all online, the Justice for Magdalene's research website. They actually asked me to be involved with the work at Donnybrook, so that's how I got into it, because I'd worked with some of the people from Justice for Magdalene's before. And although their archive, attempts to be very transparent, it puts all its information online, one of the issues is that it was really guided by the guidelines for the McAtackney report, because the aim of that archive was to submit oral archives, which were then rejected by the McAtackney report. So they were really focused on the kind of questions that the McAtackney report decided were important, and they were often about active resistance to being held in those institutions. They weren't about the everyday life and the everyday violence of being kept in them. And they get the same with the Waterford Memories Project. Is very much influenced by Justice of Magdalene, so they have their own skews as well, and that's why we have to be careful when we're working with memory and with oral archives, is they have their own skews as much as paper archives have their own skews, as does material culture, obviously. But the more that we try to bring these things together, the more nuanced ideas we can get about how those places actually functioned. So again, as I said, I was very focused on this question of methods and sources. Particularly because the initial fight for recognition and redress from victims and survivors took a legalistic route and a legal framing. This was really based on official archives, and there wasn't too much questioning about the limitations of how we think about and understand the past through official archives. And the primary role of those orders records were to monitor, control, report, and manage the institutions. And so they hold a very specific perspective on how those laundries functioned, but they don't represent the lived experience of that past. And that's something that's been quite difficult to get, the politicians and kind of legalistic scholars to take on board. As recently argued by anthropologist Dominic Bryan, there is an overemphasis in Ireland on historians' interpretations of the recent past, and particularly the use of archives, which is problematic for many reasons, including the nature of the archives is quite colonial in an Irish context. In the north, it's still a colonial archive. In the south, it was a colonial archive till the 1920s. And, the Catholic Church could also be argued as a colonial institution as well. And there's also issues with survival. We can't access a lot of the records. Some of them have been destroyed. But also the state archives were destroyed. A lot of them were destroyed in the Civil War. So we have a very limited access to archives anyway about the past. But there's also a lack of recognition that there's other ways of knowing what happened in the past. And one of those is through looking at materials. So one of my arguments has been that there not only is a right to access the archive, but also to contest and to add to it. So to look at these oral archives, but also to look at material culture as another means of accessing the past. And really to look at how we understand the role of memory, oral testimonies, and materials as being brought together to create different types of situated knowledges, which, allow for the archive to be disputed more effectively. So to get on to other interesting bits, that's my background to what kind of work I've been doing since 2018. But the types of sites that I've been looking at are these are the three main sites. Sunday Wells in Cork, I haven't got much access to because it's owned by a developer who doesn't answer emails and won't give me access to it. But I have had access to the paperwork connected to it because my current employer, University College Cork, used to own it. So they let me look at their archives, probably not knowing why I'm going to look at them. And there was a lot of photographs with it, so I got a good sense of what it looked like as it closed. Sean McDermott Street is one of the main laundries, and it was the last one to close in 1996, and it's in inner city Dublin. The interesting thing about it as an institution is that it was attached to, it had other institutions within it, including industrial schools and a convent, quite a large convent, which is what the front of this building is. It was also owned by Dublin City Council after the convent, the order transferred it to Dublin City Council, which again we've never really discussed about, but I think one of the reasons was because by that time there was the starting to uncover mass graves, unmarked mass graves at some of these sites, and I think the church started to move to transferring land instead of selling it up on the open market so that they could kind of rid themselves of it without too much contestation. But Dublin City Council since that time has tried to redevelop the site, and they tried to sell it in 2019 to a budget hotel chain. So we do need more hotels in Dublin. And so part of the problem with the city owning it is that they have not tried to maintain it. So they've left it open to the elements, and it's been essentially a derelict site since 1996. With different types of interactions with it. But at this stage, the roof is not particularly secure. There's ways of getting in and out of the site. There's trees going through parts of it. So there's not, I would kind of argue this is a facilitated ruination. So there's an attempt to ensure the site doesn't exist. Donnybrook has had another slightly different type of history. It was situated in the outskirts of the city. So at the time it was built in the 1850s and 60s, it would have been on the outskirts of the city itself. It wouldn't have been in it. But now it's in a very wealthy suburb of South Dublin. And it's hidden down a kind of alleyway beside a police station, which is interesting in terms of the things we know now about the role of the police in maintaining these sites. It was operating till 1993, and at that stage it was sold on to a private laundry firm, which continued to operate it until around 2014. Officially in the McAtackney report, it says 2011, but I found a lot of material evidence that that site was still in some ways active until 2014. And I was asked to come in after it was sold on to developers who wanted to create housing on this site, kind of middle class, upper middle class housing. And they wanted to partially demolish what was left of the site and build new homes in it. And the city archaeologists sent back their attempts at planning permission to say they needed to engage with the social significance of the site. And at that stage, that's when I was asked to come on board. So my kind of attempts to do this work have been to look at the role of contemporary archaeology in doing a site like this. I seen there was a number of archaeological firms that were brought in initially to try and do some work, and they had quite conventional ways of going about that. They wanted to look, trying to trace underground to see if there was any disturbances of soil, to see if there was any mass graves, which I was pretty sure there wasn't going to be because the site itself is actually quite contained. It's not the entire laundry site, it's just the industrial part. So I doubt, I did have strong doubts they were going to bury anybody's body right outside the front door of the laundry. But they also were interested in looking through just to make sure from those excavations. And then their report suggested that also the industrial machines should be recorded as well, which I thought was quite a limited idea of what you could do with a site like this, because again, it refocuses away from the women and the men, the women and the girls who were placed on those sites, and focuses on the machines and the monumental remains, because that's, as archaeologists, what we're more comfortable with. But seeing development archaeology became embedded in the Irish planning process since the 1990s, it has maintained this kind of idea of monumental remains being the most important, and also primarily material remains that predate 1700s. So a site like this would very rarely have been considered part of the archaeological part of the planning process. But because of this heightened interest after these reports came out, the city archaeologists decided in 2016 that there was a need to materially address its social significance. And interestingly, that put us in an important position because historians weren't able to access this site. Any other social scientists weren't. It was only archaeologists because we're involved in the planning process. So I wanted to take a more contemporary archaeology approach to this rather than a traditional historical archaeology. And that was really to look at the role of what Harrison has called surface survey. So to look at the kind of messiness and the convolutedness of what is left in the contemporary world and to figure out what we can say about that. To take into account the material memory that Laurent Olivier has talked about, and the need to be conscious of selection of what survives and continues to shape our understandings of the past, because these sites, particularly Donnybrook, had a huge amount of stuff left inside it. So there had to be a selection process rather than just going for the obvious big machines, but actually trying to think about how do we know more about this site? How do we work with other types of sources, including people, including archives, by selecting different ways of interacting with the material remains. As ever, I'm always inspired by Buckley and Lucas's book on contemporary archaeology because of its interplay around absent presence and presencing absence. So allowing to look at things that are not there as well as are there, but have some kind of material trace to them. And I wanted to avoid allowing for the dominance of the monumental and to consider also what does not survive, because it's often convenient that certain things were not there and certain things you could see had been removed. Methodologically, I thought it was important to include people who have meaningful connections to the place we were exploring. I wanted to see what their memories were and their reactions were. And I developed work I had first initiated in Long Kashmir's prison, where I wanted to bring people connected to the site to walk around it with me and to talk about the material remains and what kind of memories they brought forward. And part of that was to move away from oral histories being a kind of self-conscious way of recording a particular idea of what they wanted their memories to be, but actually allow the memories to bounce off the sites. I can talk more about that. I'll not do it in this talk. I'm happy to talk about it in questions, but there was kind of a lot of issues around trying to do that, particularly from an ethical perspective as well. I did want to work collaboratively with other specialists who I thought, could bring a lot to this work. So I work with people I trusted in the Irish development archaeology world, including Frank Miles, who I knew, would really get the social significance of doing this work. And I also contacted the National Museum of Ireland because they had recently created a Contemporary Ireland collection. And I thought it was an important way that we could actually start to transition some of this stuff into the museum sector so that these kind of histories could also be retained for future interpretation rather than just be left behind as a part of a planning process. Okay, so this is more kind of going into the details of the sites, and I'll going to very quickly go through some of the backgrounds of these sites because you could also talk about them for a long time. So just to give an overview of Donnybrook, as I said, they're two quite different sites, and I'm mainly going to talk about Donnybrook, but they're actually an interesting comparative. Donnybrook as a site was sold in 1993, and it was sold just as an industrial complex. So everything you can see around it, apart from the small houses, was actually part of the wider religious complex, which is still there. So it still has a substantial convent. It still has a number of other buildings. Actually, it still has some of the women's accommodation, but they're not accessible. The convent and the order will not give access to anybody to it. And you can see the red building to the right-hand side is actually residential home, which they initially created as like a nursing home for the women who were still left in the laundry whenever it was closed and the industrial laundry was sold on. But now it is more like an old people's home. So, and I've also been in that, but there is some women in there who had originally been Magdalenes in the laundry. And as you can see, it is quite a big but convoluted industrial complex, and there isn't very much spare space around it. There's only a tiny patch of land at the front of the door where the chimney is. Otherwise, there really wasn't going to be burials, I don't think, underneath there. But interestingly, in this notice about the sale of the land, there isn't actually any reference to it being a Magdalene laundry, because even in 2016 there was a sensitivity to these types of sites and what happens to them. There was an architectural firm that was brought in to do some work on the phasing of this, and as you can see, it is quite a convoluted building which has different phases added at different times. Phase G and F were not added until after the Magdalene laundry had been disposed of and had been sold on as just a kind of industrial laundry. But interestingly, it did still look quite similar to what other laundries look like. So there was an interesting question of authenticity in doing some of the oral histories. That the women went through those parts of the buildings and they still responded to those bits of the sites, even when they hadn't actually spent time in that bit of the site because it wasn't added till afterwards. The women that I spoke to, and I only did a small number as a bit of a pilot project, They had all been in different Magdalene laundries as well. So there's certain things they kind of recognize that would have been from other laundries, but they had seen some kind of touchstone of it in that laundry, and other things that were specific to this laundry in particular. So again, interesting in terms of how we disentangle what that all means in terms of memory of these sites. Sean McDermott Street is a different type of complex. And again, it has a red line to show you, what is part of it. Parts of it have already been sold off, as you can see from the newer block of housing on the left-hand side. That used to be part of the laundry complex, which also had an industrial school on it. That would have been more the industrial school. There is the part of the front here is mainly the convent. The part here, I hope people can see that, in the middle is the church, which is the only actual building on that site which is listed, and none of Donnybrook is listed. And then the long building beside the church was the women's dormitories. And that's what I was most interested in, because if we wanted to talk about the stories of people who were there, we need to, look at the places where they had actually been. And all this blank space here was part of the industrial laundry. There was a small fire in that industrial laundry after it had been operational, and the Dublin City Council used that as a kind of pretext for demolishing the entire industrial complex. And it wasn't a big fire, so again, it looks like there was an attempt to just get rid of what was there beforehand. But there is still some traces of the laundry there, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. So some of the archaeological methodologies that have been used, a couple of other companies were involved before I was asked to do some work here, and IAC did the excavations, which were about trying to locate potential human remains, which they didn't find any of. But they actually did have quite an interesting role in what happened afterwards, because they dug a lot of holes all over the site, and they didn't refill them again because it was a site that was going to be redeveloped. And a lot of those holes look kind of ominously grave-like, which actually had kind of a strong impact on the women I was doing oral histories with, who were coming into these sites that were covered in dirt, but also had grave-sized holes all over them. So I had to kind of remind them that there wasn't any bodies there. That was just from the archaeological work. But also, as part of them trying to find these spots to dig up, they disrupted a lot of the material world of what was in there, which had been kind of left the way it had been for a long time. So there was quite a substantial role of the archaeologists unintentionally in what I could do afterwards. And they used an architectural firm to do the phasing of the standing buildings. There was some question as to whether some of the walls in the buildings were medieval, which it appears they weren't. But that would have been part of the building that was listed, whereas none of the buildings being listed from the 19th century aspects, and that's all connected to the Magdalene Laundry. I asked my colleague Frank Miles of Archaeology and Built Heritage to do a wide-ranging holistic recording of the site. So instead of just looking at laundry context, to also look at the social, religious and industrial context of the site from how far back we could get to present day. So again, not having a kind of endpoint of 1993. And we could date some of the stuff back quite far. There was definitely machines from the 1930s and onwards. Actually, it was amazing quite how much of it was dated prior to 1993 when the site was sold. I did some site responsive oral testimonies with survivors and victims of the site. I work with Brenda Malone from the National Museum of Ireland to figure out what kind of collection could be taken from there, and they've already used some of it in their Contemporary Ireland collection. And I also did some examination of the walls looking for graffiti, which I'll not talk about because there wasn't very much, but there was little bits of it. It was an interesting process. I'd mainly done some graffiti recording in an old prison in Dublin, and there wasn't anything like what was left there. But again, I think that's really an issue of how this environment was not really a site for creating graffiti in. So to go on to some of the pictures of what the site looked like, just to give you an idea of how convoluted the kind of surface assemblages were. I came into sites which were like this, which essentially still had all the industrial machines in them, had a lot of old furniture, a lot of which had been made in the industrial laundry. There was still a workshop in the laundry that workmen had been in, and actually that's part of some of the few bits of graffiti were the names of the workmen. They had written their names on the walls. And particularly a lot of this furniture, which is painted light blue, I kind of call this like a Virgin Mary blue, which I thought might have been associated with the you know, with just the religious order, but actually it's kind of a normal kind of color for industrial complexes at that time. Apparently it was used a lot in industrial kitchens as well, because it was supposed to ensure insects didn't stay on some of the furniture, apparently. But there was a lot of furniture like that lying around the place. There was a lot of laundry, like I think there was like 50 plus laundry carts from different eras. And you can also see there's a lot of disruption from rubbish that's been left on the grounds, but also a lot of graffiti from people who have got into the site in more recent past. So it was a very busy site with a lot of things going on. And what I wanted to really think about was, you know, the changes that had been created also post-operatively. So there was cardboard boxes, quite large ones everywhere, which had been from widescreen TVs where the packaging had been dumped there afterwards. Municipal rubbish collection is not a thing in Dublin, so you have to pay for your rubbish to be taken away. And so people would quite commonly dump in sites like this. And you could see that this was where local people were coming to dump, you know, large things like boxes that would be hard to put into their domestic rubbish. There's also these wooden furnitures. There was quite a lot of these types of tables all around the place, which would have been used for different purposes in terms of the laundry. There's a lot of movement of materials for excavations, a lot of this dirt everywhere in on the ground and tracks everywhere, and that's all came from the holes that were dug. And there was a lot of graffiti, and particularly there were certain places that were attacked more than others with the graffiti, which was kind of interesting. For example, this word abuse was written in quite a lot of walls. And there was also in later times kind of anti-partition graffiti was put in some walls. But the most graffiti place was the offices where the originally the nuns, but later the offices the administrators would have used were really covered in graffiti and were covered in paint and all sorts of stuff. So it was kind of interesting in terms of like there being a bit of a social protest aspect to how people were getting into the site, but there was also just illicit use of a site like this. And there's quite a few YouTube videos actually of people who've got into it, who have taken videos over the years. But cutting through the abundance of stuff, there was some really kind of iconic aspects that were still left there. So these ironing machines, which are beside each other on the ground, they're both were made in Glasgow and they date from the 1930s and the 1950s. So, you know, obviously they were there for a long time. And a lot of the machinery, there was some machinery that was more recent, but a lot of it dated back before 1993. So essentially, the footprint of this place was the same as it was. And it was interesting how little actually had changed, particularly as you can see with this statue of the Sacred Heart. There was plinths everywhere, which would have had religious statues and emblems on them, but actually some of the statues were still there. And I was kind of amazed that this place had functioned for another decade after it was a Magdalene Laundry and nobody had taken the religious statues down. But I thought there was an interesting pragmatism as to how these are being used. Like this is quite an ornate plinth, the type you would see in a church more often than a laundry. And there's a lot of plinths around doorways and around places that the women would have looked, which obviously, you know, is strategically put there. But there's also a pragmatism in terms of you can see these little holes around the rim, and these are pins. So they would have had notices pinned on there as well. And whenever we first went in, there was a notice pinned on that plinth, which, you know, was just giving directions to how someone was supposed to iron trousers. And I also thought it was kind of interesting how precarious the Sacred Heart was, because he was being nudged over so that there was a fan on the other side to keep people cool. So there's, you know, an interesting kind of intermixing of industry pragmatism alongside the religious role of these buildings. And then again, looking at some of this absent presence and presence and absence, on one of the plinths in the main sorting room, we found some paperwork that was still attached to the wall. It was inside like a plastic folder. And this gave an indicator not only of what the rooms were all used for, some of which was pretty obvious, but because they were quite disruptive, some of them didn't, you know, weren't quite clear exactly how they'd been used. So we knew, as you can see just about the underlay of writing here, says you are here. And that says it's a folding area, that's a packing area, and that's a packing area. So in the large room, we didn't quite know exactly how it had been used. But I thought it was also interesting that these two rooms had religious names. So one was St. Anthony and one was St. Bridget's. And they were the two main rooms that were used for ironing and for kind of folding materials, clothes mainly. And that plinth that I had shown was up here. and that was the calendar room. So calendars were used for processing sheets, which would have been bedding mainly, and also sheets for hospitals, sheets for restaurants. So a lot of this work was on an industrial scale, not just for local people. There was a lot of old sinks, and apparently these are quite popular now with housing renovations. So they all disappeared over the course of the first summer I worked there in 2018. So again, a lot of these things I just have record of by photograph, because some of the more attractive remains were being kind of pilfered from the site, and I'm not quite sure how they were getting them out, because there seemed to be only one way in, which is through an upper story window. But all those disappeared over a couple of months. A different type of presencing, which I thought was interesting, and this is Sean McDermott Street. Even though the laundry was taken out, a lot of the footprint of the laundry was still in the ground. So you can see here the grate, and also this is where one of the large laundry machines would have been. And these also indicate where the toilets would have been, and the walls still had the fans in them. So there was a way we could kind of still represent what that site was, which I thought again was kind of interesting in terms of how much had been cleared away from that site. And one of my saddest ones is that all these religious statues disappeared. And if I had known there was people who were going to be going pilfering them, I think we would have taken them out quicker. We wanted to record them properly. And as I was living in Denmark at the time, I came over 3 times that summer to do the recording. By the second time I came over, all the religious statues had been either broken or had been taken off the site. So we never got to take the Sacred Heart. We have a broken statue that went into the National Museum, but we don't have this one, which is kind of sad. Again, these sites were about containing women and keeping them away from the wider society, either for society polluting them or them polluting society. But there's a lot of evidence of external networks. And we found a lot of paperwork on an upstairs room, which must have been given to the new purchasers when it was sold as a going concern. And so these are receipts in the 1970s and 80s mainly, indicating how much money was brought into the laundry and also who was paying for their services. And what's really important about this is that the religious orders have always disputed that they made much money from these endeavors. They claimed that actually they were that these were mainly philanthropic, and that the women just about made enough money to keep themselves. But, it was pretty clear that the religious institutions were making quite a lot of money out of them. And this became even clearer when we got a forensic accountant to look at the accounts to see how much money they were making by the 70s, which was when the population was declining quite a lot. So what you could see, by that stage is that all the major hospitals, a lot of major hotels and restaurants, rugby teams, Leinster Rugby played across the road, still does. UCD, which is University College Dublin, was just up the road, and it was also had a contract there. So, and there was also just middle class housing, like women coming in to collect their laundry. And we also found a lot of plastic bags which had different names on them. So these were kind of laundries in the city centre that were pretending they were doing their own laundry, but actually they were sending it to the Magdalene Laundry to do as a kind of industrial endeavour. And that's really because they weren't paying any of these women, obviously, to do that work. I found a lot of these hampers, which were also, a lot of these were taken by the National Museum, because they're super interesting in a number of ways. They show that these laundries did laundry for each other, but they also show the networks were not just about geographical location. The one at the top is the most kind of awe-inspiring one from a lot of us trying to look at these connections between the state and between these laundries. And it has Aras an Uachtaráin on the top of it, Phoenix Park, Dublin. Aras an Uachtaráin is the house of the president, and it's not that close to Donnybrook. So they had their own case with their laundry being done at Donnybrook, and that was being brought back and forth. And that, again, is the type of material evidence that you just couldn't wish for. But there's also a lot of things going on post-operatively that show that these sites had a big impact on, the kind of psyche in Ireland. And Sean McDermott Street, in one of the upstairs rooms, we found these 3 plans of the 3 different floors of Sean McDermott Street. And what I noticed whenever I started to look at them is that actually there was quite significant changes made to some parts of these sites, particularly Sean McDermott Street, by kind of social activists afterwards. There was a social activist theatre performance put on in this site that we had heard of in the early 2000s. And this indicates what changes they had made to the site. So if you can see, the piece of paper in the front has red written in a box in the corridor space. And then what I noticed was in the second and third floor, the walls were painted this kind of blood red, which was actually kind of horrific. It did look a bit like a horror film. But, you know, we had to be careful then that what we took on board as being contents of this site were not always what they seen. Sometimes they were playing to stereotypes of how horrific the sites were. So this is the kind of thing that we've seen in an upstairs room, these bright red walls, and this huge kind of crucifix was, from what we can tell, moved from the basement area up there to facilitate part of the performance. And in the ground floor, in the dormitories that the women used to be in, there was a lot of scatter cushions, which we think was for people sitting on the ground. And also these baby strollers. There was no babies kept in this site. You know, we're pretty clear about that because there was a lot of mother and baby homes that they would have been in. They wouldn't have had strollers in here. But we think, again, this is conflating the mother and baby homes and the Magdalene laundries and showing evidence of, you know, material culture of children, which we don't think was actually part of the original site. There's also these kind of unofficial memorializations going on, which I noticed as I went about both of these sites. This Project Sheila was putting these Sheila na gigs on the wall. There's also some kind of little booties were being hung off the outsides of the convent building. And then I found these kind of faces being graffitied in the inside as well. So there's this kind of, you know, desire to reconnect the social injustices that happened in the past there. I'm going to really quickly give 5 minutes on the oral testimonies and then I'll finish up because there's a lot that can be said about them, but I'm really happy to answer any questions on that. So one of the difficulties with doing these oral testimonies is that I didn't want them to be too re-traumatizing. And obviously it is re-traumatizing for a lot of people to go back to these sites. So nobody was kind of forced to do it. We only asked people who we knew had seen the sites before and who we thought would want to take part in this process. And so I only used 2 women individually, and they were allowed to bring somebody with them whenever we did this kind of walkthrough. But what was interesting was the process of ruination had a really big impact on them. Both of them were kind of audibly shocked whenever they came inside, even though I'd shown them pictures of what the laundries looked like now, to see how decrepit they looked and how ruined they looked, you know, created quite a lot of anxiety, but also really affected how they were able to remember, and particularly with one woman over another. There was really quite interesting things that they still were able to find. One of the women, when we were walking down the side of the main sorting room, there was a lot of furniture just being pushed to one side, and she just pointed to this piece here and said to us, "Oh, well, that's a bedside table." And as far as we were aware, there was no domestic furniture in there because the domestic part of the site hadn't been sold with the operative bit. But it does appear to be a bedside table, and particularly you can see from the top of it, there's a mark for where the kind of jug would have been placed for the women to wash their faces. And so they nearly always would have one of these chest of drawers beside their beds in the old part of the laundry. So this is the only domestic piece of furniture that we have in the entire site, and we wouldn't have known it if the woman hadn't pointed it out to us. She also pointed out, again, a lot of these blue things that we find everywhere. There was a blue crate, and I wouldn't have looked at it, you know, very much because, you know, it's just a crate. There's a lot of other furniture and other things that we could look at. But she pointed this out as something that the women would have put in front of the machines to stand on to help themselves get inside the machines to pull the laundry out. And so she particularly pointed this out, which was something that, again, none of us would have looked at or thought about. And this meant that it was kept because it attached to the oral history, which, you know, were passed on also to the National Museum. This sorting table was just sitting in the corner of the sorting room. And again, you know, it's kind of clear what it was used for. There's still labels on the front of it to show where different pieces of material were put. But one of the women, again, started telling us a story about how whenever they were sorting, they weren't allowed to talk to each other. So the women didn't often have strong social connections because they were being surveyed all the time, and constantly there was attempts to stop them forming bonds with each other. And she told us a story about how one of the nuns would have stood at another part of the room and constantly recite prayers back and forth. And if you weren't seeing, you know, if you weren't seen saying your prayers, so you're trying to not say anything or to talk to somebody, you said that the nun would come down and rap you on the head with something. So just seeing this piece of equipment brought that story back, and she told us in quite a lot of detail about this kind of enforced working environment that you wouldn't have known otherwise. But as I said, the ruination of the buildings did ensure that there was ruptures in memories. One of the women had a really hard time remembering anything particularly tangible about the site, and one of her most common refrains was, "I don't really remember anything." But the two things that she did remember were quite intangible. So she remembered that there used to be music played in the laundry, which again is never really talked about, that there's, that also music can be used so that people aren't talking, but maybe the environment wasn't quite as oppressive all the time as it would have been in the 50s or 40s or whatever. And she also talked about the heat. And you can see from, the paint coming off the walls, probably that, was in large part from this being an overheated building that then, stopped being used altogether. Okay, so I'm just about finished. My argument is that archaeology can have a significant role to play in understanding the experiences and material worlds of Magdalene laundries, but we need to have a holistic and creative approach that engages with the imperatives of the exercise rather than just recording all the big and obvious things. Think about, how do we work with people in archives, and how do we try to get the nuances of what these sites were at different points in time. I think we need to consider how sources that are not located through excavation can help us understand the materialized recent past. So how do we work with memory and various forms of archival records to add nuances to our understandings? And one of the issues in Ireland is that historical archaeology, and particularly contemporary archaeology, is not really taught in universities. So most of the people doing development archaeology don't have a background in thinking about how to do this work in a different kind of way. And I think that we need to also consider these relationships between various material and immaterial forms. Archives are problematic, but materials also have their own issues, as does memory. And really trying to think about how we triangulate those sources might, help us consider a bit more how we constitute absence and presence whenever we're doing this type of work. Thank you.